Taming the High Cost of College, Episode 109.
You have kids, they grow up, and before you know it, it's time to plan for college.
Where do you start?
How much is it going to cost?
Will you qualify for financial aid?
Should you be looking into scholarships?
When will you be able to retire?
What about student loans?
The list of questions is never ending. The good news is, all the answers are right here. Welcome to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Here is your host, certified financial planner, Brad Baldridge.
Hello, and welcome to Taming the High Cost of College. I'm your host, Brad Baldridge. Today we have a great interview with John Hupalo, who is the founder and CEO of Invite Education. They have a great website. John also just released a book on college planning. So we're going to learn a ton about overall financial planning and how to leverage the internet and some of the resources that John and others are putting out there that kind of help us get our head around college planning. I think for the biggest challenge for most families when it comes to college planning is you don't know what you don't know. In other words, there's lots to learn and you're not even sure where to start and what you may be needing to learn and what you may be completely ignoring or missing because you just don't know that it's something you should be doing. So he's got a great service on his website where he kind of breaks it down for families at any age, whether you've got a newborn or a kid in high school. They've got some resources that will kind of help guide you along the way. So for most families, jumping in and learning the college process is a challenge, and he's got some resources as well as a book. Before we jump into the interview, we have a Brad Recommends where we're going to talk about extracurricular activities and college fairs. As always, show notes are available at tamingthehighcostofcollege.com. Let's go ahead and jump into Brad Recommends.
The latest tips, tricks, and tools you can use today. This is Brad Recommends on Taming the High Cost of College.
All right, today on Brad Recommends, for the core area, I want to talk about extracurricular activities. There's a lot of confusion out there because ultimately extracurricular activities for some families are critically important in getting to where you want to go. And for other families, extracurriculars just don't matter at all. And it's great to have some, but it's not going to make much of a difference. So the first step, I think, with extracurriculars is to really understand what you're doing as far as extracurriculars and whether or not it's appropriate for what you're trying to do. So as an example, some of the higher end schools may require you doing extracurriculars at a very competitive level. In other words, not just being part of the football team, but actually being part of a championship football team or being a captain of the team or other things like that. Or perhaps it's not just being involved in band, but perhaps also playing your instrument and being involved in a statewide or national level music ensemble of some sort. So extracurriculars can have a big impact on admissions, and they also can have a big impact on scholarships. So there's a lot of scholarships that are based around extracurriculars. As an example, if you go back to episode 72, we have a great interview with Michael Vauder, where he used science competitions and robotics as an avenue for him to win scholarships as well as coveted positions at certain universities as part of his process. Now, not everybody's going to excel at that level. And for some families, your extracurriculars, again, if you're looking at a local state school as an example, they may not consider extracurriculars that important, especially if you've already got a strong resume as far as test scores and or grades in high school. They may not care much about extracurriculars. On the flip side, they might use extracurriculars to give you the benefit of the doubt. In other words, if you had average or below average test scores and average and below average grades, they might say, well, but you excelled at extracurriculars, so we're going to go ahead and give you the admissions or give you the shot with a scholarship. So again, the number one thing about extracurriculars, I think, for most families is that you understand where they fit. Some colleges consider them important, some colleges don't consider them at all, as well as scholarships and majors potentially may have an impact as well. Now for the optional area, I want to talk about college fairs. College fairs are a great way for families especially when you're first starting out, to get in the room with 10 or 20 or 150 colleges and understand a little bit about each college, get a chance to get a little bit of basic information, pick up their brochure. And it can be very eye-opening for a student that's just starting out as far as what kind of choice there is and getting an opportunity to just kind of kick the tires at a couple places and learn a little bit. So college fairs are provided by an organization called NACAC, National Association of College and Admissions Counselors. And we have a great interview, and we'll put that in the show notes as well, where we talk about that. And they're also provided by other organizations at the state and local level. So what I encourage families to do is to figure out if there are college fairs in your area or college fairs within driving distance that you would want to attend, and get them on your calendar so you know that when and where they are so that you can plan accordingly and take advantage of them. As an example, here where I live in the Milwaukee area, the NACAC fair is always about October 1st. And there's also Wisconsin Education Fairs, which is a completely different organization. And they provide fairs all over the state of Wisconsin. And both of those are available. So what I'd encourage you to do is go to Google and type in, Seattle area college fairs or college fair Seattle and see what pops up. And then put it on your planning calendar as far as when they are and when you might be able to plug into them. Now, another great opportunity is potentially for later in the process. If you've got a senior, let's say, and now you've narrowed it down to 6 or 8 colleges and you want to get more detailed information, you might be able to go to a college fair and talk to reps from 6 of your 8 colleges all in one place, all in one afternoon, and be able to kind of touch base, gather additional information, get some questions answered. Or maybe they can't answer your questions, but they can get you in contact with somebody that can. So college fairs are a great opportunity. Take a minute right now and figure out when and where they are in your area and put them on your calendar so that you can make a conscious decision as to whether you want to plug into them or not. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the interview with John. All right, today I'm sitting down with John Hupalo. He is the founder and CEO of a great website called Invite Education. Welcome, John.
Good morning, Brad. How are you today?
I am doing great. So you have this great website out there, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about it. But before we do that, why don't you tell us a little bit about your story and why you came to found a website to begin with?
I appreciate that. It is a little bit of a story because my background was very much in the finance area. I was an investment banker. I was a CFO of a publicly traded student loan finance company. And after all that experience, and also the experience which was probably the most relevant, and that is I have 2 daughters. One is 23, out of college now, has a job, thankfully. And my younger daughter is still in college. But when I went through that whole process, I realized that despite my personal experience and my professional experience, it was really apparent to me that families, when I talk to them and I'm trying to discuss this whole issue of college financing and planning, really wasn't getting through because there weren't resources out there that I could point to and say, go and try this or go and try that. So my co-founder, Peter Mazareas, was one of the industry leaders and visionaries, frankly, when we started the 529 college savings programs back in the 90s. And Peter and I have been friends and now business colleagues. And we said there's got to be a better way to help families plan and pay for college. And we really started thinking about what that meant. And we realized that the pain points and the frustration, the anxiety came from a couple of different sources. And one of those, just this overriding cost issue with the schools. It's so expensive no matter where you go. And that creates immediate anxiety for families. So there's that emotional reaction that folks have. And we said, look, if we can really just sit down and try to help families understand that there are actually just a discrete number of steps that need to be taken along the way, try to demystify and simplify that process, we would add something to this conversation. So inviteeducation.com was born about 5 years ago. Earlier this year, but of course we've turned the corner. So I'll say in June of 2016, we published a book called Plan and Finance Your Family's College Dreams. And both of those together are meant to be complementary so that families can get resources, plain English resources, not a lot of jargon. When we have to talk about jargon, we explain exactly what it means. But what we really want to do, again, is give families an opportunity to look at each child individually, the family together, and understand this college process and how it uniquely affects their family situation. So that's why we started InviteEducation.com and published the book. And since then, we've gotten some great response from folks like you and others who realize that we're adding to this conversation and trying to help families plan and pay a little better.
Absolutely. So I like what you're doing on the website. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about what the website does and doesn't do and kind of a little more about it?
InviteEducation.com is meant to answer really three, we thought, significant voids in the college planning marketplace. And one thing I'll tell your listeners that I think they need to have the frame of mind when they're thinking about college is to realize that they're consumers of education. So they should use the resources that are available that they would use to buy anything. Buy a car, they go online, they search, they do research, whatever it might be. Now, if you want to buy a home, same thing. You can do online research before you even step into the home. Well, we think it's exactly the same purchase decision for a college education. So what we did is broke it down and said there are some really important issues that need to be addressed. So the first one is that most families have more than one child. So the way the websites have all been set up previously is I can go on, look for information for that one child, but they're not asking me a lot of questions about the child that's coming behind. So at Invite Education, you simply put in your name, each child's name, their birth year and month, and then you get an individual folder for each child. And when you do that, you get great specific guidance of what you should be doing for that child in that particular grade. So for instance, if I have a baby, let's say a newborn, thinking about college for newborns is not really all that crazy because the question is, what should you be doing? Well, two things. One, understand just generally what the cost of college is today and what it might be when that child's ready to go to school. And then two, and very importantly, how much do I have to save, or how much should I save, or how much can I save, and what will that be worth when that child's there? So the directional advice for younger families is to save. When you have a child in middle school, the InviteEducation.com program will say to you, start to understand their innate abilities, what they like to do, so that you have a path going forward once they get to high school. And once they're in high school, then it's full on college planning. So that was one thing. We wanted to provide that guidance for families to know specifically what they should be thinking about in each grade. The second thing that's really important is that college fit, finding that right college, we think has two important points to it. One is, first, can the student get in? And second, can we afford it? So previously, the discussion had been focused around, well, if my kid can get into this school, I'll figure out how to afford it later. And the problem with that is when you try to buy now and pay later, it's like if you go into a car dealership, you don't say to the 18-year-old, hey, go find the car of your dreams, load it up with everything you want, and we'll figure out how to pay for it later. So on our site, we really try to give families an opportunity to see how much that school costs today, how much it'll cost when their student goes to school, how much their savings, and then very importantly, is this an affordable school? And we also have a little test in there to say, throw in the students' grades, put in their test scores, and we'll match that against some data and give you an idea, is this going to be a reach school for this student, or is this a match school, or is this an easy admit?
Right, absolutely. So sounds like you've got material there for parents with students of any age, from newborns all the way through kids are already in college, perhaps. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. Right now we have services right up to the 12th grade, and we're actually building out. We're working with some colleges on what we're calling the college years, so we can provide some services after that. But for right now, it gets up and helps families plan right up to the point the students leaving the family to go to college.
Right. So there's kind of some key areas when it comes to college planning that I've talked a lot about on this podcast, but there's kind of the stuff that the parents do by themselves, which is the financial stuff, and then there's the stuff they do with the student, and then there's the stuff the student does by themselves. So like visits is a joint effort. Applications and essays, theoretically the student does those all by himself.
Theoretically.
At least that's the goal. So is this appropriate then for parents and students as far as each of the pieces of the puzzle as well?
Well, it is, and it's interesting that you frame it that way, particularly around the conversation and interaction with the students, because those of us that have been through this know that once a student gets in a freshman year and sophomore, and then all of a sudden that communication gap starts sophomore year, junior year, senior year, because now this family is going through this really turbulent time internally. Because the students getting older, they're spreading their wings, they're starting to drive, they're becoming independent at the exact moment that they're going to make a really important decision, and that is what school are they going to go to. And that's a huge financial implication for the family. So we have families talking to us all the time and say, I just don't understand why my son or daughter wants to go to this big fancy private school with a big price tag, where for what they want to study, their field and major, they can get a as good or even better education at a local or state school, and we could save all this money. But how do I talk to my kids about that? So we built this program in the parent's voice so they know what's going on for their student across the spectrum when they're going through the grades, because sometimes the kids are really, frankly, just not telling us. So you can kind of bird dog that a little bit. But very importantly, you also permitted then to just invite the student to come on the site. So there's a place there to do college searching, scholarship searching. There are tips, for instance, you mentioned visits. We have a tips on what you should do when you go for visits. So it's written for the parents, but it's also meant to be this great opportunity to interact with the students as they're going through the process as well.
Right. Well, great. So as you've been working with families and that type of thing, where do you see the kind of the biggest benefits that families get by participating in your website?
Well, I think the first is it seems to put them at ease with regard to at least knowing what they need to know about. One woman said to me, I go to all these, different events and parties and the like, and I really get sucked into all of the emotion and drama of all the parents talking about all this. And there's information and there's misinformation. But when I use the site, I know very clearly that these are really the 5 or 6 things that I need to do. As you say, that there's only a few things. You need to have an application, you need to take some tests, you need to get some recommendations, that sort of thing. And when parents see that there's an actual process involved and they don't have to worry about all of it at once, and they're able to go grade by grade, it makes it a little bit easier. So what I mean by that, on our site, when you come into the 9th grade and you look at financial aid, it tells you generally what's the expected family contribution. What does that mean? How is it calculated? But it also says, hey, good news here. You don't have to worry about this until senior year. And then when you come back on the site in senior year, said, okay, now this is very specifically what you need to do. Here are the deadlines. Here is what you need to file your application. Here's a link to the FAFSA, federal government FAFSA website. All of that. So again, we don't want to overwhelm families, but we want, and we try to do this in the book, to lay out pretty simple step-by-step guides as to what's important at that particular time in the life cycle of the student going off to school.
So one of the topics that I also noticed on the website was scholarships. Can you tell us a little bit about what's available through the scholarship portion of the website? And then let's talk a little bit about what your website or your philosophy behind scholarships is, because I think there's a lot of different approaches that families can take.
Well, that's exactly right. And let me just start at a much higher level discussion. And that is, I believe that there's an affordable school for every student, every family. And what I mean by that is, without worrying too much about loans to start, let's just go and say, if I didn't want to take a loan, how would I find an affordable school? And one is, how much money you saved. And here I tell people, just be realistic. Don't be optimistic. This is a number. You know how much you saved by this junior year, senior year. So you know how much you've saved. But then importantly, understand where you can get the free money. And in our world, and we talk a lot about this again in the book and on the website, but be really careful when you get your financial aid award letter, because schools will tell you that the federal loans are actually aid when in fact that has to be repaid. So they say, you know what, I crossed that off the free money list because I have to repay that. Same thing really, frankly, with work study, because you have to earn that. So it's not free. There's some price tag associated with that. So understand the amount saved and then understand how much free money you can get. And those come, as you're suggesting, in two forms, grants and scholarships. And grants are usually need-based aid, which means I file that FAFSA form in the school and the government comes back and says, well, here's how much you're eligible for based on your income, number of kids in school, age of the eldest parent, all of the things that you know about. And then there's the second part of that are the scholarships or merit-based aid. And the merit-based aid really comes from two different sources. One is the school itself. There are ways to get merit aid, and it's just not the best student in the class, the brainiac types or the great athletes, but schools want to round out their class. So, if they're looking for an oboe player or an actor or some other talent that students have, they might get a free scholarship, either whole or part, from the college without even asking for it, frankly, without even applying for it. It comes with the application or the award letter. Frankly, my daughter is going off to a school in just outside of Indianapolis, and she got some merit-based aid, we think largely because they wanted some geographical diversity in their class. So here's this girl from New England who was interested in this smaller school outside Indianapolis, and lo and behold, there was that opportunity. But I think what you were really asking me about, I took a little time because I wanted to make sure that your listeners understood this really important concept around where the free money can come from. But the other place where the other source, if you will, of scholarships is from third parties. And we tell folks that you should go to guidance counselors. There are websites out there that will do scholarship searches for you. The scholarship search on inviteeducation.com has data in it from Petersons.com. So Petersons is a well-known academic company, and they have a scholarship search engine in there. They also have data, which we use, that has something on the order of billions of dollars of scholarship money available. So using that search engine, you can go and avail yourself to these different scholarships and find opportunities for that free money that doesn't have to be repaid. I think it's a huge opportunity for families. I do want to give one caution, and we actually did a podcast ourselves on this. We have one on YouTube called My College Corner, and 1 minute in My College Corner. We're going to talk about this in a few weeks, but there is a downside to third-party scholarships, and that's this. If you're awarded a third-party scholarship and you're getting that need-based aid that I mentioned earlier, grants, the school will reduce the amount of the grant aid by the amount of that third-party scholarship. So some families think, well, this is really great. The school is giving me $5,000 of need-based grant aid, and my son went out and he won this $1,000 scholarship from one of the local community groups. So I have an extra $1,000 available for school. Well, it might well be that the school, the college, will reduce that amount of the grant award by $1,000. It's the way the federal government wrote the rules. It's not really up to the school. Having said that, though, I would caution your listeners, if they're in that circumstance, to go and talk to the financial aid officer at the college, because they can be very creative in ways to work through those scenarios, because they don't want to see students who are high achievers or winners of these different scholarships, anyway penalized in that process. So there are ways that they can work through some of that very well. But again, it's just something to know, because most folks think, oh, this is really terrific. We've got all these third-party scholarships, and they are. But again, if you have need-based aid and you're getting a grant from a school, there could be a somewhat of a negative effect there.
Right. So then information is available on the website that would cover both the institutional scholarships or scholarships from the colleges themselves, as well as the outside private scholarships?
we have a scholarship search engine families can use, and then the way we account for the institutional aid that you mentioned is that we ask families to put in their adjusted gross income, and then the program will tell them based on that adjusted gross income how much aid that particular school gave to families in that income bracket at the time they last reported it to the federal government. So that's where we pick up the average amount of aid that a family might expect from a particular school. And that's on a school by school basis. So if you have different schools, say, okay, based on your AGI, here's how much that particular school awarded to families in the last reporting period.
Right. Let's kind of switch gears a little bit, because you had mentioned that you're personally dealing with college because you've got a couple of daughters that are either in or have been through the process. And I guess in your experience, what have you discovered that kind of would stand out as something that you'd like to share with other parents that are kind of on the other end? You're near the end of the process. What would you tell parents that are at the beginning of the process?
Yeah, I would say a few things. One is that it's really important to try to save some money and for college specifically. And the reason I mention that is that the families will say, well, my children are very young and I have a long time, so if I wait a few years, that won't be a problem. I'll be able to catch up. And the reality is that, as you know, you're so much better off even saving just a little bit early on in some of these savings programs. And we happen to like the 529 college savings programs. And Wisconsin, frankly, has some very good programs there. The EdVest program is really just terrific. And that's a minimum of $25 open the account. And then I think you can make $15 minimums with automatic contributions. So those are really good plans. And again, if you go on our site or in the book, we have a calculator there that tells you the cost of delaying. So if you wait a year or two to begin the savings, we'll tell you how much more you have to contribute to make up that amount of your goal savings. So I think number one is, trying to save early. Then families on the other end of the spectrum will come and say, well, but wait a minute, I have a junior in high school or a senior in high school, so it's too late, right? And I say, no, I think that's wrong. I think it's never too late. Why? Because most students, unfortunately, take more than 4 years to graduate. And even if they get out in 4, if you're a junior or senior, you're still going to have expenses 3, 4, 5 years down the road. So, I think it makes sense to just try and save a little bit whenever you can. And the reality is that saving $1 for college today is better than borrowing one tomorrow. So, save rather than borrow is really good. And then the second piece of advice that we like to talk to parents about is just this idea of taking a breath, realizing that, it's like kind of when you're trying to potty train your kid, you think it's never going to happen. Well, college is kind of the same way as it comes. And there's going to be some success there. If the student's properly motivated and they want to go to school, they're going to find a school that works out. There are very, very, very few families that I talk to who say, boy, this college it was a disaster for my kid. It just didn't work out right. For most kids, even those that transfer once, they find their way. It takes a little bit of time, but the process is going to work out very well for most families. When you look at the statistics, despite the costs and everything you read in the newspaper about, excessive borrowing, almost all students, meaning a large majority, 60 or so % of them, they go to school, they borrow an appropriate amount of money, they come out and they earn money far in excess of what they need to repay, making it a really great return on that investment.
Right, absolutely. I work with a lot of families, and in the end, borrowing reasonably to make your plan come together is, certainly an option. And I would say for most families, I have very few families say, well, this, financially is just not going to work out. I guess we're going to cancel college. I mean, that's just not an option. So in the end, it just becomes, how can you do things in the most efficient way possible? One of the things that I've been thinking about, and I'd like to hear your opinion on as well, is I think a lot of families kind of don't really think about or bake into their cake, so to speak, the amount of time and effort that they're going to spend on college, both parent time and student time. And obviously you've just been through it. So can you give us an idea of, how much time and effort a typical family might spend, on your website as an example, and visiting colleges, and what do you think is appropriate?
Yeah, that's really a terrific question. I'll tell you, I've spoken to many hosts of shows and podcasts, and no one's asked me that question. I think it's almost like the affordability question. So you don't want to sort of out that, if you will. But so my sense is this: that if you are reasonable in your expectation and you start early enough, meaning 8th grade, 9th grade, where you just become a little familiar as you're going along. And I tell people you don't need a 5-page strategic plan to get your son or daughter into college. What you need to do is pay attention along the way. So in the 9th grade, the second that bell rings in homeroom of freshman year, the clock is really ticking toward when that college application is going to come. And the students really have about only 2.5 or so years to get their track record together, so that when they're juniors and seniors, they have a really terrific story to tell the colleges. So a little bit of time along the way, maybe in 9th grade, just understanding what the process is. We find on our site, families come up late at night on the weekends. They may spend 10 or 15 minutes or so on the site. They read the pages. We wrote our site in what we call snackable content. So it's really bullet points and just how-to explanations, not dense paragraphs. And we find the average family spends about 1 minute and 20 seconds or so on each one of our content pages. They spend more time on the search engines. And clearly, by the time you're into junior and senior year, when you're bird dogging and starting to, start to understand that, okay, it's not only the college visits, but now we have the test prep, and is, Johnny writing his essay, is Sally out there getting those letters of recommendation lined up. What we want to be able to do in our book and in the website is just let parents know this is what's going on in the process. This is one of the first, maybe even the first major decision that the student makes. And we actually have that conversation, say, okay, who's making the decision about which school to go to? And, families have different views of that. They say, well, it's our money, so we're going to decide. We know what's best for Sally. Other families will say, you know what? This is my son or daughter's. They have to go there. They're going to be the one who has to live with that degree, so they can figure it out, and we'll worry about how to pay for it. And there's everybody sort of in between. So it really depends on the families thinking philosophically about where they want to be with that student in the process. Do they want to hold their hand all the way through and drag them to the finish line, or are they watching the student get to the finish line and supporting them along the way? So it's hard to say it's going to take you 3 hours a month or 20 hours a year or whatever. Our view is start early, be generally aware of the process, understand critically what the deadlines are, because we know kids don't think much of deadlines. We understand the importance of that, and just make sure that you're prompting them along the way to have a successful application process.
Right. And I think what you mentioned is starting early, because there's a learning curve to college. Your second and third, I would assume, was a little easier than your first. Right. Because you start learning the jargon and the process and the forms, and your fifth FAFSA is a lot easier to fill out than your first.
That's right.
So starting early, I think, is important, and just again immersing yourself. So you mentioned you've got snackable content on your website. You've got 1-minute videos or 1-minute podcasts, and you're working on other podcasts. Obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, so just getting yourself plugged in and spending a little bit of time every week or every month will help get you up to speed. And I think that's a strategy that most families need to be more aware of, because that otherwise it's crunch time in the middle of the junior year, and that's when people feel way overwhelmed.
That's precisely right. The idea of any of this surprising people is what one of the problems, frankly, we're trying to solve. There's no mystery to this. The deadlines are set years in advance of when the tests are, when the applications are, and you just need to be aware of it. And I think your point's the right one. The families that say, oh, I have plenty of time, they're missing a big opportunity to wring some of that emotion out of it, because they can think more clearly about what's happening. The other thing that we say all the time is that the kids today, I think in large part because of the financial crisis. Remember when they were 8 and 10 years old or 7 years old, that's when their parents were losing their jobs. They were reading all about the terrible things that happen from having excessive debt, not only in student loans, but across the spectrum, credit cards and autos and homes, and all that was going on. And I personally believe, and I saw with my girls, they want to be responsible. They want to understand what that means to be a responsible borrower, as you mentioned before, and a responsible consumer. So that conversation, if you're talking to a junior or a senior, sometimes it might be late. But if you're talking to a freshman or a sophomore, an early junior, and saying, look, when we think about colleges, there are two things that are really important. One, are you going to be happy there? Is there a right academic challenge level for you? And is this the right place from a fit perspective? And two, how are we going to afford this? And I think more and more families are starting to have that conversation. It's really healthy, and the students are buying into it, I think, frankly, a lot more than they did 15 or 20 years ago.
Absolutely. And of course, the prices are higher too. And right. So I guess going to the 15 or 20 years ago, the bottom line is the game has changed substantially since most parents dealt with college in their own life. And that's the other thing that they need to be aware of. All right. Well, you gave us a lot of great information. You mentioned a book, you mentioned a website. So can you give us all the contact information where we can find some of that stuff, and in case we want to learn more?
Oh, Brad, yeah, thanks so much. I enjoyed our conversation today. So the few places, inviteeducation.com, and for your listeners, we'll make the offer if they use the discount code 3FREE, the number 3 and free, FREE. They'll get 3 months free subscription to the site. So hopefully they'll avail themselves to that. And that's at inviteeducation.com. Our YouTube channel is Invite Education. And if they'll subscribe, we release a new short tip or the longer version, about 15 minutes. But we release them on Wednesdays at 12:15 Eastern Time. And then finally, Plan and Finance Your Family's College Dreams was published by Peterson's. And they can find it at Amazon, or the publisher tells me I have to say wherever books are sold. So
there you go. All right. Well, I really appreciate it. And I will spend some time on your site checking it out as well. And we'll stay in touch.
Thank you very much, Brad. Have a great day.
Thank you. All right. That was a great interview with John. Again, I would encourage people to figure out how you want to learn about college and go do it. In other words, if the idea of working at a website and kind of clicking through and doing the bite-sized information that he's providing, then go do it and get it done and sign up for the program and spend a little time learning about college through that program. Or if you'd rather, get his book and read a book, or plug into more podcasts, or however it is that you want to learn. I think for most families, it's just committing to a little bit of knowledge every day. All right. That's all we have for today. I appreciate you listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Now it's time for you to take action. Head to tamingthehighcostofcollege.com for show notes, bonus content, and to leave feedback for Brad. The next step on your college journey starts now.
Brad Baldridge is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research and an investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Securities are offered through Cambridge Investment Research Incorporated, a broker-dealer and member of FINRA and SIPC. Brad owns two companies, Baldridge Wealth Management and Baldridge College Solutions. The Baldridge companies are not affiliated with Cambridge Investment Research.